Imperialism encompasses the Pacific Ocean. Chapter 2, 1900 to 1914. Imperialism, the policy, practice, or advocacy of extending the power and dominion over a nation, especially by direct territorial acquisition or by gaining indirect control over the political or economic life of other areas. It was the twilight of the land-based empires. They were countries that expanded by absorbing or conquering neighboring territories. And the biggest countries would have been Russia, China, and the Ottoman Empire. This was the Ottoman Empire in 1913. It consists of Turkey, Lebanon, Israel, Syria, Iraq, Iran, parts of the Arabian Peninsula. Middle East. This is a map of the Middle East. The current map is on the left, and you can see what companies the Ottoman Empire used to encompass. It's Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, part of Saudi Arabia, Jordan, the European culture attracted both defenders and opponents in the Ottoman Empire. Political leaders. Ottoman leaders believed government should move to a more liberal constitutional monarchy. Turkey should have a future of its own, and the young Turks should live under its own laws and values. Other regions should determine their own fate. Russia. This is a map of Russia. Russia is the largest country in the world. As you can see, to the north of Russia is the Arctic Ocean. Many of Russia's ports are choked with ice in the winter and even at other times of the year, so they have no natural ports where they can ship items. There are some areas there in the Pacific, but basically they have none. The Crimean War. It was a war between Great Britain, France, Turkey, and Sardinia on one side, and Russia on the other, fought chiefly in the Crimea in 1853 to 1856. As you can see right here, this is Crimea. It's an island right in the middle of the Black Sea. And Russia always wanted to have control of this area because they could go through the Dardanelles, this little straits right here, and onto the Mediterranean Sea and outwards to the Atlantic Sea, or they could go through the Suez Canal. Russia at that time was ruled by Tsar Nicholas II, and this is he with his family. There was a division in Russia between the elites loyal to the Tsar and radical opponents, workers and students, which would lead to the Russian Revolution in 1917. Many countries in Europe feared the expansionists of Russia. It raised many fears. The Brits sympathized with the old regime, and that's basically due to the fact that most of the kings and queens in Europe were related to each other. The Americans saw Russia as brutal and despotic, and that would be natural for them because America is a democracy. The other country I want to talk about is the Qin Empire. Now, China used to be the focal point of trade and was thought to be very advanced. But as nations industrialized and militarized, China was left out of that. The weakness of the Qin Empire contributed to tensions between Russia and Japan, and how that contributed between tensions is because Russia and Japan coveted much of China and their resources, especially in Manchuria. Because of China's decline, unequal treaties to the Europeans, Americans, and Japanese were made, and they'd been favorable. There was something called the open door policy, and this was established by the United States. It was a term in foreign affairs initially referred to the U.S. policy established in the 19th century and early 20th century that would allow for a system of trade in China open to all countries. And each of their countries had a sphere of influence that was theirs and theirs alone. In Great Britain, they owned, or ruled, I should say, Hong Kong. And you can see the problems it's causing today because they are used to a form of democracy, and now they have had that taken away when they're ceded back to China in 1999. The Qing dynasty was not able to respond to the challenge from the West. Again, they were not industrialized, nor did they have the military weapons or navy to compete with the West. Many Chinese thought the Qing dynasty was the biggest problem because they were despotic. They didn't allow any rights to people. One man that was trying to change this was Sun Yat-sen. He was a Chinese politician who was elected provisional president of the Republic after the fall of the Qing dynasty. He relinquished the presidency of Yuan Shikai, but later opposed him and formed a military government in southern China. Yuan Shikai was a military leader and government official who rose to power during the Qin dynasty and tried to save the dynasty with a number of modernization projects, such as dams and irrigation. Traditional wealth and modern trade land-based empires. Land-based empires were wealthy because they had agriculture, and the empires were large enough to have a variety of agricultural zones, so they retained their self-sufficiency pretty much, and they were not forced to seek external markets. That will change from the 1700s and 1800s to the industrial age in the 1900s. There was early trade imbalances between Europe and land-based empires. Land-based empires increased their wealth in the 17 and 1800s, but declined in the 1900s. In China, foreigners controlled ports at Canton and Shanghai, and they had a sort of gun diplomacy, which was diplomacy backed by the use or threat of military force. Early trade imbalances. Land-based empires traded with the Europeans, and as I said before, they increased their wealth in the 17 and 1800s, but with the advent of industrialization, that changed. But the Europeans controlled the terms of the trade, and usually there were certain cities that they traded in, such as Istanbul, Turkey, and in China, Canton and Shanghai. Traditional wealth and modern trade. Land-based wealth came from agriculture. Empires were large enough to have a variety of agricultural zones, and they had a high degree of specialization in crops. By 1900, imperialism and market imbalance. Europe offered goods needed for military reform and industrialization. They supplied advisors to other countries and made loans to other countries. The Qin and Ottoman empires were land-based empires that had incredible wealth, but they had poor tax systems. Old empires depended on foreign loans and control of tariffs. Same old story. Extraterritoriality is a state of being exempted from the jurisdiction of local law, usually as a result of diplomatic negotiations, used by Europeans, especially in China, but also in Africa and the Far East. And basically, their citizens were exempt of any crimes they may have committed. The Chinese could not try them. Africans could not try them. They were under European jurisdiction. Europe in 1900. A restructure of global power and influence. Europe became the center of power. ancient capitals of Asia, Middle East, and Africa were just on the outbounds. Pacific imperialists. Russia was basically an imperialist power. Britain and France also were imperialist powers, and they impeded Russia's expansion and acquisition on the Black Sea. Europe worries about Russian expansion in Northeast Asia as well. Russia slowly is building up military and industrial strength in the North Pacific, and that was one area where they could go out to the ocean when it wasn't choked by ice and snow. Japan arrives. Shoguns, a hereditary commander-in-chief of feudal Japan. Because of the military power concentrated in its hands and consequent weakness of the nominal head of state, or the emperor, the shogun was generally the real ruler of the country until feudalism was abolished in 1867. Japan. Provincial leaders overthrew the shogun and established centralized government. Strong military that would preserve Japanese independence. Matthew Perry and U.S. imperialism. U.S. imperialism began in 1853 when Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Edo Bay and demanded that Japan open itself up to the world. And what could Japan say when they had battleships coming at them with cannon, and Japan had relatively no new weapons? The Meiji Restoration, a turning point in Japanese history in 1868, was when the last shogun was overthrown and the emperor assumed direct control over the nation. The following the Meiji period, 1868 to 1912, was marked by Japan's opening to the West and the establishment of a strong central government. Japanese imperialism was to protect itself and obtain resources it lacked, and its attention was on Korea because of the mineral wealth it had, and Manchuria because of the agricultural wealth that Manchuria had. Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895. It was a war between China and Japan over the control of the Korean peninsula. China was overwhelmingly defeated at Port Arthur, a Russian base in Manchuria. Even though they had a victory over in the Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese did not gain much. The other nations, the European nations, made it known that they weren't going to give much to the Japanese. They saw the Japanese as inferior. Social Darwinism. It argues that social progress resulted from conflicts in which the fittest or best adapted individuals in entire societies would prevail. And many imperialist countries use this social Darwinism to justify its imperialism. Read pages 47 through 48. It will explain it more in depth. The Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905. It was the first all-out war in the modern era in which non-European powers defeated one of Europe's greatest powers. As a result, the Russian Empire and Tsar Nicholas II lost considerable prestige, along with two of their three naval fleets. Japan and imperialism. Japanese military expansion and commercial expansion were inseparable. By 1910, Korea was made a formal colony of Japan. The Qing dynasty was on the verge of collapse. Japan made inroads into Manchuria. China's government became increasingly decentralized. The U.S. and imperialism. Spanish-American War was a war between Spain and the United States, fought in 1898. The war began as an intervention by the United States on behalf of Cuba against